Star Wars has always spoken the language of myth, but myth only works when failure is allowed to scar the world it inhabits. In its earliest form, the galaxy felt dangerous because victory was never guaranteed and survival always carried a cost. Characters lost friends, limbs faith and certainty, and those losses shaped who they became. Modern Star Wars increasingly resists that discomfort. By insulating its heroes from lasting consequence, it turns danger into performance rather than reality. The result is not empowerment but erosion, because when nothing can truly be lost, nothing can truly matter. In contemporary storytelling, peril is frequently staged but rarely followed through. Characters fall only to rise again intact and wiser without paying a price proportionate to the risk. Battles end with minimal change to the status quo, and even apparent deaths are treated as temporary inconveniences. This pattern teaches the audience that loss is cosmetic. Suspense becomes hollow because the story itself signals that everything will be undone in time. Tension collapses under the weight of inevitability. When heroes rarely fail, victories stop feeling earned and start feeling scheduled. The audience senses the narrative safety net long before the climax arrives. Conflicts become exercises in spectacle rather than tests of resolve. No matter how dire the situation appears, the outcome feels pre-selected. The story loses its ability to surprise because it has trained viewers not to expect consequence. Triumph becomes routine rather than revelatory. Failure is the engine of character, but modern Star Wars often bypasses it. Protagonists make mistakes yet emerge unchanged. Their beliefs are affirmed rather than challenged, and their identities remain intact regardless of outcome. Growth becomes decorative rather than transformative. Without loss there is no reckoning, and without reckoning there is no evolution. Characters drift instead of develop. Earlier Star Wars understood this instinctively. Luke's failure on Cloud City reshaped his understanding of himself, the Force, and his enemy. Anakin's inability to accept loss defined his descent. These moments did not exist to shock, but to redirect the story. Failure forced adaptation, and adaptation created meaning. The galaxy moved forward because characters could not. Reversible consequences undermine this process at every level. Resurrections, retcons, and miraculous escapes erase the finality that gives sacrifice weight. When death can be negotiated and tragedy can be rewritten, courage becomes cheap. The audience stops mourning because experience has taught them. Mourning is premature. Emotional investment becomes cautious, guarded, and shallow. This erosion does not only affect heroes. Villains suffer equally from consequence-free storytelling. When antagonists are defeated repeatedly without altering the balance of power, they lose credibility. Threat becomes theoretical rather than tangible. The galaxy feels safe because nothing ever truly breaks. Evil becomes a nuisance instead of a force. Without the capacity to win, villains cannot generate fear. A universe without real failure feels smaller because it feels managed. Risk is simulated, but never allowed to spiral. The edges are padded and the floor is soft. The galaxy no longer feels indifferent to the protagonist because it bends around them. That bend is visible, and once visible, it cannot be ignored. Scale collapses when the world exists to protect its heroes. True loss restores proportion. When characters fail, the story grows beyond them. Consequences ripple outward, affecting systems, relationships, and futures. The galaxy regains autonomy because it no longer guarantees survival. This indifference is what once made Star Wars feel vast. Heroes mattered precisely because the universe did not revolve around them. Failure re-establishes that balance. Allowing characters to lose would give Star Wars back its most valuable tool: honesty. Loss forces reflection, and reflection forces change. Characters must confront who they are when victory is denied. Some grow stronger, some fracture, and some disappear entirely. All outcomes are meaningful because none are protected. This unpredictability is not cruelty. It is respect for the audience's intelligence and emotional capacity. Villains become frightening again when their victories reshape the narrative rather than reset it. A lost battle should not simply delay success but redefine the terrain. When antagonists win, systems change, allies vanish, and hope becomes harder to justify. Resistance gains weight because it must push against accumulated loss rather than a clean slate. Fear returns not through spectacle but through consequence. Tragedy is not the opposite of hope, it is its prerequisite. Hope without the possibility of defeat is not hope at all, it is assurance. Triumph only resonates when failure is plausible and visible. Star Wars once understood that optimism must be earned repeatedly through sacrifice. Removing that cost turns hope into an aesthetic rather than a belief, a galaxy where heroes sometimes lose mirrors. Reality more closely than one defined by constant success. Growth in real life is uneven, painful, and often born from mistakes that cannot be undone. Myth does not escape this truth, it distills it. By allowing failure, Star Wars aligns itself with the human experience it once reflected so powerfully. Stories feel larger when they risk breaking their characters. Letting characters lose would restore danger scale and emotional honesty. It would remind the audience that courage is not rewarded automatically, and that belief does not guarantee survival. The galaxy would feel hostile again, and therefore worth fighting for. Victory would regain its meaning because it would no longer be assumed. This is not a call for nihilism, but for balance. Star Wars does not need darker aesthetics or grimmer tone to achieve this. It needs commitment. Commitment to outcomes that cannot be undone, and choices that permanently alter trajectories. Failure must close doors, not open new conveniences. Only then can hope feel like an act of defiance, rather than a narrative promise. What comes next is the hardest part to confront. Allowing real failure would change how Star Wars tells stories at a structural level. It would require endings that do not comfort, and arcs that do not resolve neatly. But it would also restore the mythic weight the franchise once carried effortlessly. If you want me to continue forward into what losing would actually give Star Wars back, and why failure is the missing ingredient in modern myth, just say next and we will carry it through. What losing would give Star Wars back is proportion. Failure restores the correct relationship between character and universe by reminding the audience that the galaxy does not exist to validate its heroes. When defeat is allowed to stand, the world feels larger because it does not bend to narrative preference. The story stops protecting its protagonists and starts testing them. That shift alone changes everything, because meaning emerges from resistance rather than reassurance. Loss forces characters to confront the limits of who they are rather than the height of who they might become. Success confirms identity, while failure interrogates it. When a character loses something irreplaceable, their values are no longer theoretical. They must decide what remains worth protecting when victory is no longer an option. This is where belief becomes visible, and character is revealed rather than asserted. In a story that allows real failure, growth cannot be cosmetic. A defeat that costs nothing teaches nothing. But a defeat that removes safety, certainty, or belonging reshapes behaviour permanently. Characters adapt not because the plot requires it, but because survival demands it. Their worldview narrows or hardens or fractures. These changes accumulate quietly and make later choices heavier because they are informed by memory rather than optimism. Failure also restores the credibility of antagonists in a way no amount of spectacle can. A villain who wins changes the shape of the narrative landscape. Systems shift, alliances dissolve, and futures close. The audience feels this loss not as shock but as absence. Something that should have been there is gone and will not return. That permanence gives threat meaning again. When villains are allowed to win occasionally, the story regains asymmetry. Power feels uneven and unfair, which mirrors reality more closely than heroic equilibrium. Resistance becomes difficult rather than inevitable. Hope must be constructed carefully instead of assumed. Each act of defiance carries risk because history suggests failure is possible. This tension cannot be manufactured through dialogue alone. It must be earned through outcome. Tragedy is the soil in which hope grows. Without the possibility of loss, optimism is decorative. When defeat is real, hope becomes an act of courage, rather than expectation. Choosing to believe despite evidence to the contrary carries moral weight. That weight is what once made Star Wars resonate across generations. It was never about guaranteed victory, but about choosing to stand even when the outcome was uncertain. Allowing loss would also expand the emotional scale of the galaxy. When characters fail, the consequences ripple outward beyond the immediate cast. Civilians suffer, institutions change, and entire worlds are altered. the story becomes less personal and more historical. Individual arcs intersect with systemic outcomes. The universe regains depth because it responds rather than resets. Modern Star Wars often hesitates here because failure complicates continuity. It introduces messiness that cannot be easily reconciled. But that messiness is precisely what gives stories texture. Clean timelines are efficient but sterile. A galaxy shaped by unresolved loss feels older, heavier, and more real. History becomes something endured rather than curated. Real failure also restores silence. After loss, the story can pause rather than rush to comfort. Characters grieve, retreat, or disengage. The absence of immediate resolution allows emotion to settle. This space gives the audience time to feel rather than anticipate. Silence becomes part of the narrative rather than a gap to be filled. That restraint deepens immersion. Importantly, allowing characters to lose does not require nihilism. Loss does not mean everything ends in despair. It means hope must work harder. Some characters recover, others do not. Some victories arrive too late to undo damage. These outcomes reflect life rather than fantasy. Myth does not promise fairness, it promises meaning. Failure sharpens that promise rather than dulling it. When loss is permanent, sacrifice regains its power. Death matters again because it cannot be negotiated. Courage becomes costly because it may not be rewarded. The audience leans in because the outcome is unknown. Emotional investment deepens because it is no longer safe. This risk is not cruelty toward the viewer, but respect for their emotional resilience. A universe that allows defeat also allows legacy to function properly. The actions of one generation shape the burdens of the next. Hope is inherited alongside trauma rather than replacing it. History accumulates instead of resetting. The galaxy feels ancient because it remembers. Characters move forward, carrying scars rather than erasing them. This continuity of consequence creates scale. Failure would also free Star Wars from the pressure to constantly escalate. Not every story needs to end with triumph. Some can end with survival endurance or even quiet defeat. Variety returns because outcomes diversify. The franchise gains flexibility because success is no longer mandatory. Smaller stories become viable because they are not required to restore balance every time. What losing ultimately gives Star Wars back is honesty. Honesty about power, about fear, and about the cost of standing against systems larger than oneself. The galaxy stops pretending that courage guarantees survival. It starts acknowledging that belief is valuable precisely because it often fails. This honesty reconnects the myth to the human experience it once mirrored so effectively. The reluctance to allow failure is understandable because loss feels risky. It challenges comfort and disrupts familiarity. But Star Wars was never built on comfort. It was built on uncertainty, wonder, and the possibility that things could go wrong. Re-embracing failure would not betray the saga's spirit. It would restore it. A myth that cannot lose, cannot teach. A hero who cannot fail, cannot change. A universe that cannot break, cannot feel vast. Letting characters lose would return danger scale and emotional truth to Star Wars. It would make victory rare again and therefore precious. And in that restored tension, the galaxy would finally feel alive rather than protected.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.